think before we jump into recording, it would help to set a little bit of introduction and precedent. I think Ashwin did a good job of introducing us on WhatsApp, but let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So I am originally from Bangalore, and I did my BBA in Symbiosis Pune, post which I worked at Great Place to Work, the parent organization of Great Manager Institute. So I worked with the umbrella organization for about 3 years and worked in, people related consulting, but honestly wore multiple hats. I don't think I can define my role in just, like one term. So I did a number of roles at Great Manager Institute and Great Place to Work. And then I quit around 2020 because I wanted to pursue my MBA abroad. So I wanted to sort of invest time in that process. So now I'm working at a consulting firm called Zinnov in Bangalore, and I work in innovation consulting. But I'll be going to Fuqua School of Business in about a month's time to do my MBA, the 2-year MBA program. So that's a little bit about me. And we call me the chief storyteller, honestly, because I bestowed that title upon myself. When we just started GMI, we were just a team of about 4 to 5 people. So we decided to give ourselves titles, and I thought chief storyteller really encompassed everything that I was doing at the time. And then the title just stuck. So chief storyteller is really why I call myself I call myself chief storyteller, because it covers everything that I'm interested in and everything that I'm passionate about. But that's a little bit about me. I'd like to hear just probably 2 minutes about
me. Yeah, okay. So I'm from Mumbai. I did my engineering from Mumbai many years back, and then I joined the government service, namely the IAS. I gave the IAS exams. I joined the Indian Railway Account Service. I worked for more than 2 decades. In between, I had taken a sabbatical. I spent 4 years in UK. I did 3 degrees in UK, including MBA. I did my MBA, I did my accountancy, and I did my public policy from London School of Economics and Political Science. I was in secondment to the Ministry of Home Affairs, Director Police, and then I was Director Personnel. I was Director Disaster Management. So after 5.5 years there, I came back to my parent department, that is Railways. And then now I've finished more than 2 decades. So I have put in my papers, and then I have quit the job, and I've joined Sapio Analytics as chairman. Today is 1 month anniversary.
Well, congratulations on spending a month at Sapio. I've been hearing a lot about it.
It's been the most exciting month, I think, of my life.
Absolutely. I can imagine. Can you tell me a little bit about what Sapio is all about? What is Sapio Analytics?
Yes. So Sapio Analytics is actually an endeavor to create an AI-based shadow tech government support. The whole idea was to help improve governance and policy formulation processes using the power of data and AI. And this, in that sense, I think is a crying need. And I think COVID has only exposed that. I mean, something we felt 2-3 years back was a crying need. Today, I think most of us will agree that improvement in our governance and policy is a needed area. And I'm happy that Sapio is right in the center of that. Albeit a small way. I think we are a startup, but we have big aspirations. And one day we want to be the trusted partner for governments across many countries, not just India. So with that kind of ambitions, we have set forth. And so far we have not done too bad. We have been okay.
I agree. Stemming from what you just said, can you give us some instances of how you've worked with the Indian government in the recent past?
Okay, so our first breakthrough came actually. So we spent a lot of time on developing products. As you know, a tech company would have to first create products and services before they can actually go out to the market, isn't it? And we spent a lot of time in creating products first. And then we got an opportunity, sadly, in perhaps the worst migrant crisis India has seen since independence. So this what happened. This happened last year when I think the world saw that the migrant laborers were walking back home, and we started engaging with one agency in Government of India, trying to explain to them that time is ripe for us to create a tech platform which can sort of map whether migrants are going back, which can map how the industry would, because there was a talk of the industry being adversely affected. About what is the demand profile of industry now, and seeing how best to sort of manage this using a tech platform, how best to reduce the demand supply gap in some ways. Now I'll just maybe explain that. This is to make it more clear. So as you understand, the labor was going back and the economy was also contracting at the same time, right? So say assuming if there were 100 people working in a place A, and sadly in India, there's one thing I should mention, that India, the demand for labor is not commensurate with the supply of labor in the same local area. There are areas in India where there's a massive supply of labor, but there's no demand out there in the local area. There are not much industries there, right? And the places where the industry is, there's not much labor there. At least the labor that can be employed. So there's always a lot of movement of the workers. Now, what we felt is people would be moving back, and they were moving back to their old places. Some of them would come back. We knew that after COVID, the problem subsides, people would come back. But would the industry absorb the entire labor force? We thought, industry is also contracting. So if about 100 people, maybe 60 would be required, and 40 might not be required. So why don't we work on that aspect? Just mapping is one, but providing some sort of a solution which is amenable to all the stakeholders. So we try to map the industry requirement given the contracted economy, given the future outlook of the industry, and then we try to sort of map the labor where exactly they are and see whether they can be accommodated or absorbed in their own area of life, own area where they lived or they went back. And this was called Saksham. Saksham was a sort of a short form for Shramik Shakti Manch. That was, I think, very well covered in the news also. We were behind that project. That gave us early success. And so that's how we sort of started a journey, so to say. The other government we worked closely was government of UP. So there was a lot of talk about 1 trillion economy in UP. And then so we were engaging with the government representatives, trying to sort of give forth our point of view that 1 trillion economy can be possible in two ways, because 1 trillion economy was a quantum jump over their existing level. So there were two main ways they could do. One was get a huge FDI infusion, huge, and hope that converts into GDP economy. Or second could be, so that's one way. But then the questions would be, why would FDI come to UP and not Maharashtra, not Gujarat, and not? And there are other sort of other industrial states which perhaps vie for the FDI investment also. So there's a lot of competition among the states. So why would UP score over everybody else? So that was a tough call actually for UP. So we thought of an alternate plan. We said, why don't we focus on the unorganized sector? Because all the calculations we do is primarily at the organized sector, and a huge part of India is actually in the unorganized sector. So we said that if we mainstream the unorganized sector, that could actually give a huge fillip to the growth in economy. But the challenge was there is no ready data out there. I mean, the fact it's called unorganized means it's not well documented. We don't have enough data on the sectors there. So we got this work. We had proposed this, that we will create a rapid survey tool and using technology, of course, and to get some sort of sample about the sector, which is not really covered mostly. The use of technology was is very interesting actually. It's not what I should mention here very prominently. What we do is we don't tom about technology. Our technology is basically to make things scalable and make things cost effective. Because anything you do with technology becomes very cost effective when you work on a scalable model. But our technology is very empathetic. So if I want to work in a rural area and I say, no, I can only work, the bandwidth I require is that much, or I need this kind of, I need, it'll be a smartphone based thing. And if there aren't many smartphone users there, then the technology is not really usable, right? So the technology we believe should be enabler and it should be cost effective. That is very key to our business model. Cost effective technology, which is customized and empathetic to the customer's need. That is the key. And I think singles us out in many ways. So we used tabs, we used SMS based, we used bots, everything to cover as wide a range as possible of people. The bot, I'll tell you, is very interesting. So we bots become a very easy way to elicit data without human intervention. So we use bots because it becomes a low cost way to get data. What we did is we use regional language and we tried to get information in a way that people will be happy to share information. So for example, if you ask a poor laborer in say Bihar or UP that aapka skill set kya hai, do you think he'll be able to reply meaningfully, right? So there's no point having that kind of a system, right? So we used questions in the bot in regional language in a manner of speaking wherein we encourage him to talk about his experience. आपने कहाँ काम किया और क्या था उसमें, you know? So in that sense we derived information in a very friendly, empathetic manner. Also, a lot of skills are transferable and a lot of skills can be used in a variety of ways. So we also try to map that. So if somebody's work, he says कि मैंने tiles का काम किया, tile ठीक करने का, then that same chap with a little bit of training, a little bit of push can also do some other kind of work, allied work also. So we also try to focus on that to create some sort of a map that where else can he be employed, you know, where else is he employable. And this we did for 4 districts of UP as a pilot. And detailed reports. Of course, we had to do a lot of secondary research also to reduce the sample size, because if we have a very large sample size, then again it becomes time consuming. So we did a lot of secondary research to create some sort of a scientific basis to determine sample size, which becomes relevant, but it doesn't become too big. And so this work is over in that sense. It's in final stages. It's already placed to the government, and they are doing some internal checking, processing. Unfortunately, COVID struck again very, very badly. So I think everything is in standstill. But that's the work we were really proud about. You know? I think somewhere we felt that we have reached the heart of India in a meaningful way. And I think once the report was finalized, I think people may hear about it in the news. I hope rather.
No, that's very interesting. I think in a landscape such as India's, there are diverse challenges across the entire landscape. It's so difficult to use a one-size-fits-all approach. So you have to keep tailoring it to match your different problem statements, so to speak. And I think that what you did with the UP government was a prime example of how you really understood that market and developed that technology to address that. So that's, I think, a great example of an instance.
Thank you.
I actually want to jump from this question into understanding how is it that Sapio is working with other developing countries. So we spoke about India. But if you want to talk about the economic growth in other developing countries, in some it's very rapid. What kind of role is CPO playing in that space?
Yes, thank you for that question. So we believe that all the countries try to adopt best practices from each other. So, for example, the practice of PPP, the public-private partnership, largely came from UK. In UK, we had this. They called it PFI initially, Private Finance Initiative. Then they called it public-private partnership, and a lot of countries try to use their learnings and best practices and adopted that, of course, and adapted to some ways in their own countries. But the thought process came from there, and the experience of UK became very important for many other countries, such as India. I believe India is in a vantage position, given its size, the complexity. It could become a model, or it could become a guiding light for many other countries who are similarly placed. For example, many countries in the African continent, many countries in the South America, Southeast Asia, maybe Central Asia, which have similar circumstances. Our learning, I mean, there's a story in India which can be. So the learning that CPO has built up over the last 2 years is of great value. We have shown that we can get tech solutions very effectively in terms of cost and time. And there's a lot the world can learn from. There's a lot that many countries who are similarly placed, as like India, in parts of Africa and South America and Southeast Asia, they could learn from this. The best practices we have created could be used meaningfully. And so we have made very robust plans to reach out to the other parts of the world. Our market is that. Our market is a market that looks up to India. A market is where our learning could be directly transplanted and customized, a bit of customization used in other countries. And we are very gung-ho about that.
Okay, great. Okay, so now that we've spoken about India, specifically about the challenges that you navigate with the Indian landscape, we spoke about some developing countries. Let's talk about cities and city transformation. I believe that CPO uses a decision support system, and they use this to really transform cities specifically. Can you give us some instances of this, and how are you really doing this?
So before I go to DSS, I'll just tell a bit about the smart city, smart city work. So every country is dealing with this problem of rapid urbanization, especially the countries which are on a rapid growth path, the developing countries. And this rapid urbanization is a problem for most countries, and they have to find a solution. They also are very aspirational. The countries are very aspirational. So they have adopted smart city in a big way. Most countries have adopted smart city, just like India has. Now, India has spent a lot of money actually on creating the smart city infrastructure. And as the first step of the smart city infrastructure is trying to dissolve the silos in which we all work, in which the government department works. So the urban city administration is via government departments. And then there are many departments that work alongside. For example, fire department is separate, water department is separate, police is separate, right? And they all sort of work at some level. They have to coordinate their work with each other. And the efficiency and the effectiveness of administration actually depends on how beautifully they can coordinate. So if there's poor coordination, you see the effect on the ground immediately. And if there's good coordination, you see the effect also. So Smart City tried to integrate their databases. So they said, let's create a central command and control office where all these different departments dealing in urban administration. We all sort of come together, we integrate our data, and so we'll have one place where we could sort of have a clear understanding of the city administration, and we could derive efficiencies of that. So a lot of such cities have created a command control center, have worked on integration of data. They've appointed a system integrator, and it has been pretty high cost because that's the nature of India and the cities. We are very complex cities also. Now, what we felt is, despite this creation of an infrastructure of smart city, there are no visible signs that shows that now that it's a smart city, this has improved, right? I mean, at least the public, I don't see very much. That's not very different for a person living in a smart city and not so smart city, isn't it?
Right.
There's hardly a difference, and we try to sell the idea that, but why isn't impact visible? Why are we not able to show the manifestation into people's lives or in the environment around us, if a city has already spent a lot of money on smart city? So we thought the reason is the last mile connectivity, or the last thing that should have been done is missed out, right? The last thing was creating a use case. Now, once you have data integrated, so we said, why don't, at a fraction of a cost, so whatever money you've spent on creation of this command control center and the data integration, at a fraction of that cost, we'll create an additional layer of data analytics, where we'll do a lot of data visualization. Some part of that is being done by them also, but then we'll move further into creating AI-based algorithms using domain experts, so that one can do predictive analytics. The whole point of getting data integration is to be able to do predictive analysis, right? Otherwise, we anyways are in a reactive mode in our lives. Government anyways knows, what to do, right? When there's a fire, the fire engine is going to go. Whether it's a smart city or not a smart city, how is it different, right? But then through data analytics, you could probably then understand in the last 5 years, what are the times of the year, or what are the seasonal, is it a pattern? So the whole point of data is to spot a pattern and then use that understanding of the pattern to create better predictive analytics, so that you can have better response. Instead of being reactive, we could be proactive.
Right.
And this, we said, can happen at a fraction of a cost. So if you've already spent so much, you can spend a little more and have use cases now. That's what we did. And what the second thing we felt about DSS? So DSS we have created first for COVID, which we gave to a lot of governments, actually pro bono. We gave free.
Okay.
Because we felt that's what that's what we can do now. I mean, how do I contribute to the nation's effort?
Yeah.
Simple concept is DSS, for its full form, is decision support system. So if we can help improve decision making, we can help improve governance in a big way, isn't it? Now, we try to provide tools that could enable decision making. So when I say improve decision making, what I would mean is the speed and the objectivity. If I have better information, I would panic less when I take a decision, right? If I have better tools, I would probably plan things better, be more proactive. Right? So I would again panic less, and that would maybe help improve the governance itself. So for COVID, what we had done is we had tried to understand what is, so if you remember last year, they were this red zone, green zone, orange zone. Right? They had made this micro zones depending on the spread of COVID. So there was a talk about how COVID spread is impacting social life and economic life of people. So at that point in time, maybe we were a little early for the world. But we said that why don't, when you take a decision, to have a lockdown or to declare something a red zone, can you take a decision only on one parameter, spread? You can't. I shouldn't rather.
Yeah.
Should you not look at spread and then the economic impact also and social impact also, and then take a call that, okay, if you need to really declare something a red zone, then can we make micro zonation? Can you make it on hyper local level where you close only what is essential and you try to keep things open which is not so badly affected, right? And this, if we can create a system around that at ward level, so really for Bombay, for Mumbai, so at the ward level, we try to understand what are the industries in each ward, what are the economic activities in each ward, which are the activities that that give the highest taxes or highest revenue to the government, which needs to be protected more. So I'll give example, simple example. Let's take south of Mumbai. I don't know if you're familiar with Mumbai, but I live in South Mumbai, so I can tell you. Now, South Mumbai, we have the richest people, we have the maybe not so rich people. There's slums also in South Mumbai, and there are great high-rise buildings in South Mumbai. South Mumbai has the best offices perhaps in India, and also we have very, very small shops who are barely able to make ends meet, right? So this is what life is. Now, if I just paint everything with one broad brush, one broad stroke, I'm taking a decision that will have variable impact in different people. So now, can I now go further and say, okay, Nariman Point is an area where a lot of precaution can take place. So offices can be told that you take precautions. At that time, using hand sanitizer mask was very important. So now the big offices can afford to enforce it better. So maybe you can open up the time of offices, provided it you take precautions. And the smaller shops, maybe we can have little more education, little more awareness building, and give them different timings to open, different ways, different areas. So that was some sort of an idea actually. It is a concept stage where balancing economy, society, and COVID was attempted at, and that we call it the DSS. But to create a support system to enable better decision making by taking into different aspects of impact of COVID. The spread was very important at the time, yes. So we had sort of our own algorithm to predict the nature of the spread, and then so we could do sort of we could plan better. Like some areas we felt that this probably is going to depending on that R naught variable, this is going to spread faster. So maybe there we need to have a stronger measures of lockdown, and some areas were doing okay, so we could open up the economy in some ways. And that time there was a lot of talk about social impact. There was a lot of talk about people who were not used to being in lockdown, suffering depression. So maybe there is a need to see how that is impacting on the ground, and to see whether some sort of outreach is required for them, in terms of awareness building, or give them a sort of window of opportunity to interact socially. So that was our effort. We successfully created this system. We had also presented it to Niti Aayog. And we also gave it to a lot of small UTs, Union territories, some states, and pro bono. That was our effort to sort of help the community in some way possible. Yeah, and then we sort of improved upon that because when we felt COVID is gone, I think mistakenly. So we felt our learning of this DSS for COVID can be used for any urban administration or any municipal corporation, isn't it? Because it's exactly the same problems they have to deal with even after COVID. So we improved upon that model and try to engage with the urban local bodies. We'll do so again. I think then COVID happened again. Second wave happened again, and there was a lull. But now that things are looking brighter, I think we may start the re-engagement process. So that's work.
No, that's very interesting that you were able to touch upon a number of instances where you worked with the government, especially specific to the COVID situation that came out of nowhere to an extent. But can you talk a little bit more, Prashant, about the work that you do with law enforcement specifically, and let's say intelligence agencies?
Yeah. Now this is something very new we are doing. So we have started small. I can't say we have done too much on this, yeah, but we have made plans, and our plans are very, very robust again. So law enforcement and intelligence, right? Now, the very nature of their work is such that they don't share data easily, and nothing much is available in the public domain. What is available is historical data, which is of no consequence. So we started engaging with them, and because we'll have to win their trust first before we can do anything there. So the process is on. We stand a good chance because we've worked in many governments already. So I think in that sense, our experience would definitely give them more comfort. Another problem with law enforcement and intelligence is their data is not always available in digits form. A lot of their work is in the beat constable diaries or in their registers and in their log reports. Now, all that has to be made usable, isn't it? So we have to have a process where we digitize all this potentially useful data from a very analog source, and then collate that data, and then of course find a way to read to optical character recognition to read through machine the relevant part, and then collate that with whatever data they have, and then create some insights around that. We have a team in place, and now we'll start the engagement process. We'll need to have a pilot project first to showcase our own skills and our expertise before we can expect them to trust us fully. But yeah, we've made a start, and I'm hopeful that very soon we'll cut ice. Very soon we'll do well with our work.
So I'm curious, actually, Prashant, Sapio belongs at this nexus of startup and governance, right? So there's a startup side, which is super innovative. It's always looking for new ways to address challenges and problems. And then there's the governance angle, which is slightly more structured and conventional. And you sort of have to converge these two angles to be able to deliver the best to your customers and to the people who are investing in you. How has it been working at that convergence of these two worlds that could be so different, but should also be able to work hand in hand to produce the best results?
Yeah. So in fact, that was the starting point. We saw this opportunity, which most would not look at. But we felt this is the untapped potential of Indian market. Something like that 90% of the iceberg is this. Because government has spent, I come from government side, so I can tell you, government has spent enormous amount of resources in their IT infrastructure program. Since 1990s, huge resources have gone into creating government databases. They've got huge servers. There's a big infrastructure out there already. Tons and tons of government data is there. Unfortunately, not much effort has gone in exploiting this data, mining the data. On the other hand, we have top data scientists working primarily on the consumer data, because that's where I think the money lies, at least in the minds of the people.
Okay.
So we have top talent in the consumer data space. We have nothing, hardly anyone in the government data space. And we think this is a far more bigger pie and far more useful pie, because we are, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but we are actually driven by this mission to create a positive impact. In fact, if you see the website of Sapio, you'll see 3 prominent words there, which we really believe in. So we, at the 3, our tagline is impact, influence, and improve. So I can vouch for my team that we are driven by that motto. So we felt this is far more challenging. So why don't we get the best brains from government side and the best brains from the IT side, yeah, and the data science side? And that's what Sapio is now. Sapio has become that that melting pot of talent on either side. And I think that's the reason I think Sapio, if you see, in terms of revenue numbers, we're not that big as you would expect a startup to be. But in terms of impact, in terms of media coverage, in terms of visibility, I think we're huge. And that's only because we set out to do what most people would not dare to think about. And I think we are getting rich dividends because of our courage. I can say it's courage now. Many people may have thought it's folly, but today I can say it was courage to do something when nobody has thought about. That gave us a huge edge. And in some ways, I'm not sure whether I'll be wrong, but I think in some ways we see ourselves as a bit of a monopoly player. There are not too many people who do what we do. And not too many people, I mean, the people claim to do, of course, a lot of people who claim to do everything, but we can back it up with evidence on the ground, through the customer, the way they treat us. I can tell you, we may not have earned too much money, but we have earned huge respect and we have earned huge credibility. And I think perhaps that always meant most to us, I think, when it started off. So in that sense, we have achieved, at least we are close to achieving our goal of being sort of a trusted partner. And we want to now build up from there, take it to the next level.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm actually going to use this as a jumping off point. And in light of this partnership angle, this collaborative spirit of startup with governance, I understand that Sapio has smart healthcare, which was recently covered in a number of research and case papers. So can you talk to us a little bit about Sapio Smart Healthcare and talk to us about why it's so innovative? What sets this apart?
Okay. So I think in the same spirit of our impact creation, and it was very topical, it was contextual. The healthcare infrastructure was creaking, was falling apart. So we thought we must sort of do something about it. So we're not doctors, we can't build hospitals, of course,
right.
But we can try to create an ecosystem that makes healthcare more accessible, one, and healthcare more affordable. Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring in, we have created our own products also. So a lot of healthcare work also has to be about building awareness. So we created bots. A lot of healthcare work also has to be about advisory, so preventing the problem before the problem erupts. So a lot of advisory. So we use a bots, which are, I think, a very effective way to communicate in today's time and age. And we have created this protocol bot for the health workers and doctors. And we also created, there was a lot of demand for plasma. So although ICMR and government, I think they were like not sure about how to deal with this plasma thing, but there was huge demand for plasma. So we thought, why don't we use our work to sort of be a platform where the donors and the receivers can come together across India, and at least some lives would be saved. Perhaps, we just tried that. So we had these two bots, one for plasma, and second one we called protocol bot. That's for healthcare workers. So where we sort of we explain the different protocols in different circumstances of COVID, which I think became quite popular. It is covered in the media again. I told you, we have been lucky, we have been blessed actually. Because I think when you do good deeds, I sound like a cliche, but when you do good deeds, I think people implicitly understand that. Because this is again what we did for free. This is not something we are driven by any money. It was again our way of reaching out to the community and our way of trying to improve lives in a small way, perhaps, but it's the best we could do. So healthcare we started. I mentioned about making healthcare more accessible and affordable. I think that is the key. That is the key, because how much can India realistically spend? We can't spend so we can't build hospitals, although we would like to, of course. But why don't we do something that can augment the facility? So instead of creating more buildings, why don't we use the same infrastructure and use technology to just augment it? For example, in the ICU, there are say 4 patients in a small hospital. Why don't we use sort of technology that monitors their vitals, and using AI provide advanced warning to the doctor who's looking after. So the same doctor now can, from his mobile, then be able to monitor all 4 patients without losing his sleep, because he has an early warning system as well. So he can also pass on instructions to the doctors in charge about where to sort of divert resources. If there's some particular patient is more critical, and the effort can go there first. So this is what it's a small beginning, of course, but we do have a larger play in mind, but we'll take it slowly.
Yeah. No, that's great. I am all into about Sapio's angle of accessibility and affordability and trying to augment and improve upon existing systems. I think that's very interesting. And in light of that, I actually want to understand more about Sapio Heritage, which is another initiative that you've taken up, something again in the innovative space. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. So Sapio Heritage started something that we thought would be very challenging, but we thought that the journey would be very, very interesting. So we were not sure where it's going to go. We're not sure that what we're doing is actually going to lead us to a customer or some revenue. We're not sure actually, but we just felt that it's so interesting that even just going through the process, we would gain. In what way, we're not sure about that, but we just felt instinctively that this is something we would love to do. And so we sort of jumped in it without really fully understanding where we jumped in. And I'm happy we did that. Sometimes when you reason too much in life, you also become extra cautious, and then a lot of opportunities which could have come your way, probably miss it. So sometimes it's good to be a little foolish. I think that's what Steve Jobs said: "Stay hungry, stay foolish."
Yeah,
so I think we have literally imbibed that in our DNA. So we jumped to this, fully knowing that it's a very difficult task. Nobody has been able to successfully use AI for heritage images. Nobody has been able to do. The best brains in the world have failed. And here we thought we will do it. Not because we were seeking challenges. We were seeking joy, actually, not challenge. And we felt it doesn't make a difference if we don't succeed. What is good is that we try, we engage with people, and we bring this as a focus area. So if we start and we may not succeed too much, but we might motivate somebody else to take it up. And if sufficient number of fools are there, not fools, sufficient number of people are passionate about it, who knows? One day we can create a solution, isn't it? So with that in mind, we made a beginning. And what gave us a huge traction was something which we thought is, can we protect a 2,000-year-old heritage and preserve it for the next 2,000 years? Is it possible to do that? And so we tried doing that in a small way. So an image of Ajanta, digitized, restored, and then preserved for eternity. Through our partner, we preserve this in the Arctic World Archive for eternity. And we said, this is a beginning.
Yeah.
If this goes well, I'm sure it may motivate many others to think about it. And it became a huge thing. The Prime Minister mentioned this work in his Mann Ki Baat. The mainstream media was covering us on this work. It went to many countries outside India. So we felt we struck gold in terms of satisfaction and joy that we were seeking originally. So can we now do something and help others take some joy from this? So we created a platform called Ajanta Etsy. Etsy stands for Heritage Culture. So we have created this, it's already there, Ajanta Etsy, where we try to combine heritage, technology, spirituality, science, music, podcast. So we try to have an interplay of all this. I don't know how successfully you've done it, but at least that's our effort. That there has to be an interplay. We have to have, people who have scientific bent of mind. They look away when we speak about spirituality, right? And people who are in spirituality, they perhaps look down upon people who think of science, isn't it? Which we thought was very silly, though. Why don't we have a platform where we have interplay? Why don't we have people from all walks of life? And so have a content where we have people from all walks of life trying to understand each other. And that was an effort in our Ajanta Etsy. So if you see the portal, the platform, we have tried to have different content, different kinds of articles. Someone talking about science of spirituality. Somebody's talking about podcast. He has maybe have a podcast. By the way, our podcast and music has gone to all the platforms, Amazon, Spotify, iTunes. It has got released across the world. And then, so this is here to stay. We have created this platform. We don't know again where it's going to go, but it's given us a lot of joy. And I think we were happy with even joy. But now I think we should start thinking about how to reach out to more people. And that can only happen if once we have some revenue stream. So we have planned something. We have planned a revenue stream for that, where we offer anyone to own a part of heritage. So I think heritage and culture, I mean, I'll just end with this. Heritage and culture is very esoteric. Generally, people who have a certain level of consciousness due to maybe the wealth or the success they have, then they start thinking of heritage and culture in a big way, isn't it? And so it becomes very esoteric. But a large number of people, a huge population, is deprived of this joy. So we felt, why not create something where anybody can access, and anybody can own a piece of heritage? Why only the rich and mighty have to have a heritage own this kind of things in there with them. Why can't anybody else can do it? And so we have set up a system. We have created images, whatever images we have restored. We plan to offer them to anybody who would like to own it in his name and have it physical form as well, and also store in the Arctic World Archive for years together. And we made this affordable. Actually, we made it very affordable through our. So we are creating more prints so that the whole cost per print goes down. So a large number of people can sort of partake this benefit. We haven't begun it yet, but we are close to doing it now.
Yeah, it's amazing that you're embarking on so many new and unheard of projects in India, right from your smart healthcare to your heritage project, and there's so much white space for you to do even more. But I also was informed that you're currently thinking on planning of expanding to a few more countries in the following months. Can you tell us about which countries these are and why you selected these countries for expansion?
Yes. So before we made a plan, we wanted to create a team for that actually. Now, the nature of our work is such that we need people with a lot of experience, a lot of understanding of government, and who also have access to government. So we have created a team now. So since I've joined, we have a new team which will work with us, with me and Ashwin, my CEO, and some countries in Africa. I think I would like to avoid naming the countries at this stage. Sure. Because we started. So some countries in Africa, some in South America, some in Southeast Asia, planning to do Central Asia, and through our new partners in place, which we have appointed now, we will, I think, have a media release in a couple of days once everything is formalized. But we have brought together heavyweights. We've got very, very experienced, knowledgeable people from different walks of life who have served the government or who have a strong understanding of the government, who have strong relationships with different governments in the countries outside of India. And I think we are fully prepared to march on. So I think you will hear more about this maybe in the coming months.
Great. And what about your other future plans and strategies, let's say at the next 1 to 3 years? Anything that you want to inform our audience about?
Yeah. Okay. So two things I'd like to inform at this stage. One, our heritage work has literally gone global. So much so that we have been invited by a number of countries. They want to work with us in some ways, and they want us to work with them to promote heritage and culture in their countries. So from being a tech player, so we try to infuse technology in heritage work, right? But I think now our ambit and gamut has widened considerably. Now we're playing as like equal partner in that country center to promote heritage culture in a big way. So suddenly we have a larger play, a larger canvas to work on, which I think is very exciting. It will give us a chance to go to different countries, learn different cultures, share our learnings, and it may even help open the doors for business, for other products and services that we have already in those countries. So that's, I think, a very big win, and we will be working on this with a proper planned way. That is one thing I want to. Second most important thing I want to talk about future plans is our foray in blockchain. Now, why we think we should enter blockchain is, or what we understand, blockchain, I think the world has accepted blockchain technology, and everybody is very, very gung-ho about thinking that blockchain is the future. Like every government, I think, They have done many symposiums and seminars on this, and they've spoken about how good blockchain can be in their lives. And yet we don't see much happening on the ground, isn't it? And that's where we think there's opportunity. Because the biggest customer of blockchain, I reckon, is going to be government. Again, just like we felt that the biggest source of data is going to be government. So we feel the biggest customer is going to be government. And so if we can work with them, since we already have good relationships with the government, that's the next logical step. So after we exploit, after we do the data mining, after we do predictive analytics, what next? Right? So what next for government could be smart contracting, where we eliminate a lot of intermediaries, where we create a system where there's more transparency, there's more data security, there's more trust. So blockchain is that answer. And so we've started our work in a small way again, but we know it's a big landscape. So we want to be sure of how we want to go. We're talking to experts in the field in blockchain. And one challenge is that's going to come, which you can sort of foresee, is blockchain and cryptocurrency somehow in the minds of people go hand in hand, right? So when someone talks about blockchain, he'll talk about cryptocurrency. And we want to separate that in the minds of people, that it doesn't have to be always cryptocurrency. And so can there be a system where we can use fiat currency and still use blockchain technology? So why can't we do smart contracting using fiat currency? Right? So that is something we're exploring, because cryptocurrency is nobody's quite sure how to deal with it. Nobody's quite sure. So, but we thought best way to go about is find a system to work around it. Okay? And so that's what we started. But of course, we have also worked with NFTs. In fact, if you Google world's first spiritual art on NFT, it's us. This news went all across US and many countries. And so we have made a grand beginning, I would say. Now we only have to capitalize on something we have begun well. So while we're working with NFT separately, again, trying to help budding talent. I'll just take a minute in this. So, the world of art is just like spirituality. It's very esoteric, right? There are people in this world of art who it's a club actually. They would interact with each other. The art galleries are limited. The agents in this are limited. The art lovers are limited, and they operate in that club. Not much scope for newbies in terms of new artists or people who want to experience. And we think NFT can be that disruptive space where new talent can be encouraged to come on NFT. Luckily for them, they don't have competition, because the established artists and painters haven't started looking at NFT seriously. There are stories, there are news items about big auctions happening on Sotheby's also, but it's largely unexplored. And so therein lies opportunity, where the new talent who otherwise have to be at the receiving end of this art world can get a fresh start. And with that in mind, we have started a small pilot again to bring new budding talent. Not very new, not like absolutely novices. No, we don't need that. We need good artists who have otherwise a good place, but give them a fresh start so that they are the latent value of their art can get magnified and noticed on the NFT platform. So we made a small beginning. We have started with 3 artists, building up the store, and let's see how it goes. We made a start. The start has been exciting. We've been lucky as always. Whatever we set out, I think we've got early gains. So we've got early gains here. And while we're working on the NFT space, we're also working on the blockchain technology for the smart contracting work, which I think would be an enormous opportunity in the government space. So that's what we're trying to do.
That's very interesting to know. I actually read an interview of yours upon becoming chairman of Sapio. And in the interview, you mentioned that you're very excited to work with young people. You enjoy working around this young talent and young minds. What would you say to this current young generation of people to work for Sapio? How would you, why should they work for Sapio essentially?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Yes. So Sapio, they should work for Sapio because Sapio team, we pride ourselves because we think not just with our minds, we think from our hearts too. And I think if your workplace has a place for the heart and mind both, that can become a workplace which can give new innovations, which can have new breakthroughs. And so Sapio is one of that. We're not the only one, of course. I'm sure there are many great places to work, but we pride ourselves in that we have to be driven. So impact, impact, influence, and improve. It can't be just about money. Money is something that helps us. It has to be that passion. It has to be that end in sight, the end goal of trying to create a positive impact in people's lives. And so in that sense, I think Sapio is a very exciting place to work. If an old man like me, if I am so excited, as you can clearly see, so I think the younger people would be a lot more excited.
Yeah. As a young person myself, I'm very excited about the work that you're doing. So
thank you.
I'm sure. Yeah. Thanks, Prashant, for all of your insights and for spending time on really giving us an explanation of what Sapio is doing and what it plans for the future. It was definitely a very engaging and interesting conversation. And I hope that whoever watches this interview in the future is as excited as I am about Sapio and heading into the future. So thank you once again.
Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks.